Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Last Week in BookTube. This is a regular feature on this channel where I look back at the week, or in this case, the 2 weeks of viewing that I've done on BookTube and YouTube, and talk about some of the highlights with you, share some links to things that you may have missed, not meant in any way to be comprehensive or a full list, but nevertheless things that I wanted to share. And of course, Last Week in BookTube now, today, is not particularly possible. I mean, I could pick through my BookTube subscription feed for things that I watched that I could talk about, but there's only been one thing that's been on the mind of BookTube and YouTube and the world in the last 2 weeks. As it was about 2 weeks ago that George Floyd was murdered by members of the Minneapolis Police Department in broad daylight, on camera, begging for his life. And that film footage was totally unambiguous. You could not watch it, no matter what you are. You could not watch it and say, well, that was a firefight. That was a near-run thing. The cop had no choice. You couldn't watch it and think that. And that's been true of other videos, of course. Notoriously, Rodney King, a long time ago, was every bit as true then. But thanks to the prevalence of social media, thanks to the fact that we're all wired into each other, and that the whole world is wired into social media in a kind of a common language that's never existed before, that video outraged the sensibilities of the entire world and went all around the world and became, I don't even know what the word is beyond viral. It became fundamental to a societal conversation. And it sparked massive protests, the biggest protests in the memory of most of the people involved in them. And those protests are still going on. They're only growing in size, they're only growing in inventiveness. They have been remarkably peaceful, considering how many hundreds of thousands of people have been involved. There have been opportunists, as there always will be, who, usually under cover of darkness, will take advantage of protests to riot, to loot, to steal. But again, all of this was done on camera. All of this is happening on camera in exhaustive detail. So again, no matter who you are, no matter what you think about the brutalized phrase law and order, you can look at your subscription feeds for your various social media apps, and it will be hard for even the worst elements, the most blind people, to look at those feeds and say that, and see anything other than the truth, which is that the looting and the rioting is a small part of the demonstrations, a fraction. The demonstrations have touched a nerve. It's not that this has led to carnage in the streets. This is a response to carnage in the streets. And those protests, including large amounts of protesting outside the White House, provoked a response on the part of American police. And with, again, a few outlying exceptions, the police hugging people or taking a knee with people, the response from American police has been extremely, dishearteningly uniform. And it has taken the form of horrific violence against peaceful protesters. Protesters being truncheoned, protesters being shot, protesters being gassed, protesters standing, doing nothing other than assembling peacefully, having a policeman walk up to them, pull down the mask that they're wearing to protect others from COVID-19, which is still raging in this country, so that the cop who pulled down the mask could have a clear shot at face spraying them at point-blank range. And once again, all of this was caught on camera. All of it is still being caught on camera. And this has had two effects, and they have bled into each other, and they have culminated in a social movement, the like of which no one in living memory has ever seen. The two effects were, one, white America, the fathers and mothers, the grandfathers and grandmothers of those kids out in the street protesting, were able to see what was going on. It wasn't, oh, you're taking off and maybe you'll be part of this protest, but there's no chance that I'll see you as a grainy figure in the background on the evening news. They're able to see it up close because you're filming it yourself. And those mothers and fathers, those grandmothers and grandfathers were able to see how you were being treated. And for white America, that was an intense, has been, is still an intense psychological shock. Because white America, those mothers and fathers, those grandfathers and grandmothers were saying, I don't understand. My son, my grandson, my granddaughter, they were meeting in a park. They were meeting in a public street before curfew in order to peacefully protest, which is, I looked it up on Google, they're right under the First Amendment. And yet, the cops drove SUVs into the crowd. The cops fired into the crowd without any warning. The cops tear-gassed the crowd. The cops brought military-grade assault helicopters down to 100 feet above the ground in order to whip up a cyclone on the sidewalk and create panic. The cops kettled people in restricted areas so that they had no way to flee and then bombarded them with gas and pellets. In other words, white America saw their sons and daughters, their grandsons and granddaughters, treated exactly the way black people are treated in this country every day, where you're not doing anything wrong, where you're not breaking any law, where the only reason that you're being brutalized, gassed, shot, punched, kicked, truncheoned, arrested, held without legal due course, the only reason why any of that is happening is because the cop feels like doing it. And you have almost no redress. Virtually no redress at all. White America in the last 2 weeks has seen, that's one of the things that white America saw, is that the police are not their friends. That they don't, and when the police want to break the law and brutalize them, they don't have any privileged status. It can happen to anybody. If you have this massively armed force that you have empowered over your head in New York City, most citizens of New York City have been amazed in the last 2 weeks to learn what the annual operating budget of the New York City Police Department is. Most of them have been amazed to find out what that number is. And quite a few of them have never had this awakening before and are now realizing that number, it's obscene. I don't even want to repeat it. And that they're noticing that number, and they're noticing also that their sons and daughters, their grandsons and granddaughters, are going to school where the teachers pay for supplies with their own money, are getting massive 4-figure bills for basic medical care. White America is starting to see these things directly because these protests are ongoing and because everyone has a camera. It's not avoidable anymore. And it's also not something that's happening to somebody else anymore. White America is now getting a taste of what it feels like to be totally at the whim of the brutality of the police with no legal recourse. That's what these riots have shown. That's what these protests have shown. And they've shown one other thing, too, that white America was willing to turn a blind eye to, or maybe didn't know, which was the extent to which their police departments, local, state, municipal, have been buying military-grade equipment. Because it wasn't just the neighborhood beat cop who was out there truncheoning your granddaughter for holding up a sign in front of the White House. No, it was him and 50 of his comrades, and they were in military gear, military body armor, military face masks, tanks, assault helicopters. This is military surplus equipment that police departments have been eagerly buying up all over the country for the last 20 years. And you have the equipment, you're going to want to use it. You have the equipment, you're going to look for an excuse. In other words, George Floyd's murder has caused a radical shift in the public zeitgeist. That's kind of rare. That's history in the making. And it's caused white America to wake up and say, wait a minute, this applies to me as well. All of this applies to me as well. Maybe I have been dismissive or racist towards people. Maybe when I have been on my porch on a summer evening, I see a black jogger run by, Maybe I've had thoughts that are totally unwarranted and that I wouldn't have with a white jogger. Now, a lot of those people might console themselves by saying, well, I might have those thoughts, but I would never act on them. But after this last 2 weeks, they have had indisputable evidence of how many of their fellow Americans would act on it, and how many of those fellow Americans are heavily armed police officers. Newspaper summaries of the events, both in America and outside America and around the world, have accurately characterized this as not the public rioting, but the police rioting. And I'm sure that you've seen film footage. You can't avoid it because of social media. Unless you're off social media, you will see it. And the footage is unbelievable. Just unbelievable. Again, it will not come as a surprise to black Americans who have to live in a world in which they can be peacefully thumbing through their phone in their backyard and get shot to death. Which they can be asleep in their home and get shot to death. In which they can be walking down the street, going to a shop, coming out of a movie theater, and be shot to death. For no reason whatsoever. Because the cop is bored. Because the cop is itchy. Because the cop has those thoughts that maybe you've had on your porch when you watch a black jogger go by. But not only does the cop not have to restrain from them or feel ashamed of them, but the cop has an enormous amount of firepower and almost total immunity legally to act on them. This has made it a split conversation in America in the last 2 weeks. The conversation that is ongoing has been both systemic racism. Another look, every time there's a public hue and cry about the police executing some black person, there's always a massive re-examination of systemic racism. It's always healthy to do that, but I'm not the only person who's noticed that it seems always to be short-lived. The outrage dies down, and nothing takes its place. That isn't happening this time. If anything, the momentum is growing, and that's fantastic. It's long overdue. And the other thing, the other discussion, the one is systemic racism. And the other discussion, and it kind of goes hand in hand when you think of George Floyd, is police brutality. The unaccountability of police departments, of members of police departments. How many countless thousands of times have we heard stories and just forgot about them, of some cop who kills a kid coming out of a Dairy Queen and gets put on a desk for a week, administrative duty, or maybe he loses 2 weeks' pay. And maybe when we're flicking through Instagram or Twitter, we notice 2 weeks later that he's been reinstated, that it's all been forgotten. The kid is still dead. The family is still torn apart. But the cop has suffered basically nothing at all. And how many times have we seen that in the last 20 years alone? How many times have those stories just fled right by the eye? Maybe the third page of the local section of the newspaper, not the front page, not above the fold, just the cost of doing business. That we have these police departments, yeah, some of them will be racist, yeah, some of them will kill people who are manifestly, obviously, totally innocent. And what are you going to do? Well, in the last 2 weeks, that complacency has been under direct assault from both those angles. Systemic racism and the knee-jerk, savage violence of police departments, overfunded, over-militarized police departments. And it has been eye-opening. It always is. Wonderful, thought-provoking, disturbing, but in a good way, to watch how BookTube has responded. Because we're bookish people. We read, we love to read, we make jokes about how we've always got our nose in the book. But we have open souls. We have open hearts. I've heard it said from booktubers, and also long before there was a BookTube, that bookish people are by and large the best people. They're the most compassionate people. They're the most thoughtful people. They're the people who are most willing to change some of their thoughts. Most of them. And I've been watching that happen. I'm sure you have too. If you watch BookTube, you subscribe to BookTube, and so your subscription feed has been full of people making videos, quite a few of whom have been making videos obviously just trying on camera in real time to figure out how to process all of this and what to do about all of the emotions bubbling up inside them. I think that's terrific. It's made spellbinding viewing. And so has the coda that has followed all of those videos, which has been to keep it up, to do something about it. Don't just feel the outrage, but do something about it. I've had quite a few of you have emailed me I leave my email on every video. I'm happy to hear from you about anything. I get a lot of emails every day, so just have to keep that in mind. But I've got a lot of emails from a lot of you asking what you should do. Asking, you're okay. You're telling me I've watched 10 BookTube videos just today on this subject, and they all list links to various resources, Black Lives Matter resources, bail fund resources, petitions to sign, and I don't know how to make sense out of any of it. And of course, I'm not an expert. I don't know how to make sense of any of it either. My strong advice to you would be to research, figure out what you want to do, and research how best to do it. Find the reliable voices, the people whose opinions, whose judgment on what to do you trust, and then do it. The key thing being the second part, which is to do it. Don't just do the research, then do it. Donate the money, donate the time, donate the influence. Whatever it is, you have seen a million links to a million different resources, so have I. I don't have any advice for you because every situation will be different. My instinct, a holdover from the protest turmoil of the 1960s, is to start local, because that's where your influence will be the greatest. Always is to start local, work local, and expand out from there. But you might do the research and find out that a national initiative is more along the lines of what you want to do, something that more along the lines of making you feel like you're finally adding to this amazing swell, this amazing social change that's happening, that you can watch. It's still happening. I've been watching it. It's, of course, the only thing that I would talk about in a Last Week in BookTube right now. Except for one other thing. There's been one other thing that has grown out of this. There were two factors that worked to raise public consciousness, spark public outcry, not only in America, but around the world. Again, if you are on social media, you can see footage of astounding gatherings in London, in England, in Germany, everywhere, where just enormous gatherings of sympathy for Black Lives Matter in America. Also, there have been genuine changes and the beginnings of more genuine changes in America. There's a slogan that's been going around called defund the police, being willfully misunderstood by reactionaries, by some elements of American society. Defund the police fits on a bumper sticker. It's not that, except for in the most radical cases, the people who are saying defund the police are not saying there should be no police in the world, in the country. They're saying that police departments are overfunded. They're over-militarized. They're used as a one-size-fits-all solution to what is often social problems that don't require an armed officer to be present. A bored, irritated, perhaps not socially trained, perhaps extremely reactionary, armed servant of the state does not need to be the state's go-to solution for every single problem that comes up. That's what defund the police means, and it's a valuable thing to think about, and it's happening. City boards all across the country are starting to think about this. They're taking a long, hard look at those enormous police budgets and saying, why is this so big? Is it possible that arming our cops to the teeth and giving them barely anything in the way of social training might be adding to this problem instead of fixing it? Once you start to ask questions like that, they tend to gain a momentum of their own, but you can help. Of course, you can help. Everyone should help to keep those questions going, to keep these things going. And those two things, you see how they conflate. One is systemic racism, which is the focus of the other, which is police brutality. But there's been a third. You can see it coming a mile away. It's the Trump administration and its response to this whole thing. And its response has been absolutely horrifying. On June the 1st, the President of the United States threatened that if the governors didn't use the military to crush protests, peaceful protests, then he would do it himself. He doesn't have the legal authority to do that, but the military will do it. You want it to get debated in court 2 years from now, fine, but it still won't stop the tanks from rolling in. And the president did call in an enormous number of armed servicemen to Washington, D.C. You've probably seen the pictures. Armed soldiers, armed and armored, visored soldiers lined up, guarding the Lincoln Memorial, which belongs to me, belongs to every American, so that no one could go anywhere near it. You probably saw pictures of added police fencing that the president had installed around the White House. You probably saw pictures of the White House dark, with the president down in the emergency bunker, hiding from the people he was gassing and truncheoning. And there's one other picture that you may have seen that is the most alarming of all. And that is the rows and rows, ranks and ranks of armed and armored, visored men in Washington, D.C., with no identifying insignia of any kind, standing there, refusing to answer questions about who they are, what department of the government they work for, how they are accountable in any way. If you look at that footage, you will see what I already know. You will see something that is going to come out, if it's allowed to, and that is that they are not a member of any branch of the government. They're civilians. They're armed civilians. They're loyal to one man. They're not loyal to the Constitution or to the government. They've never taken an oath, even that they would disregard. They've never had any training. I believe it's possible to notice that about them, even if you just look at the video footage that's been taken. That is true. And the fact that they are totally illegal, it's totally illegal to do that. It is, in fact, an insurrection. It's a military coup to do that. The fact that that's totally illegal won't stop you from dying if they shoot you. And there's been no inquiry. And through it all, from the first, when the president threatened to take over the government with the army, to now, those men are still there. They are Trump supporters who have assembled this way through 8chan boards and email strains, and the president knows about it. Trump is the one who signaled it to happen. He's been denying culpability for everything. The incident that has been the most harmful to him was the gassing and truncheoning of protesters outside the White House so that he could walk across the street to a photo op where he paused a Bible for a bunch of eager cameras. It was Trump who ordered that to happen. He said to his operatives, get those fill-in-the-blanks out of there. He has since ordered his lawyer. There's absolutely no point in calling Bill Barr the Attorney General of the United States. He's not. He's Trump's lawyer. And he has since ordered Bill Barr to take responsibility for that. And Barr said it was done on his order. It was not. It was done on Trump's order. But then Barr has realized subsequently that, well, okay, he told me to do this and I've done it, but it's still getting worse and people are asking questions and I don't want to end up at The Hague on trial for war crimes, so I will say he's been distancing himself from it. He hasn't gone so far as to say what he'll say on his deathbed, which is that Donald Trump did that. But nevertheless, there's been no resistance of any kind from the Republican U.S. Senate, a body that could have removed Donald Trump, could have impeached him and removed him from office, and that could still control him completely and refuses to do so. The President of the United States openly threatened martial law, and the United States Senate, the Republican United States Senate, did nothing. Donald Trump is an idiot, but he knows what that means, and that is terrifying, absolutely terrifying. As bad as these riots are, as bad as this horrible, slippery rhetoric that I have heard people saying, it's just a few bad apples in the police department. How many hours of videotape do you have to see before you admit it's not just a few bad apples? How many testimonies from black people do you have to hear before you realize it's not just a few bad apples? A few bad apples could not have terrorized an entire 2 generations of black American citizens, job-holding, family-raising, tax-paying citizens who can't go out at night, can't walk unmolested in the street, can't act on the presumption of their own innocence. They can't do it. Black people in America can't do it. They can't say, well, I'm presumed innocent until proven guilty. They know perfectly well they're not presumed innocent and they could end up dead long before there's any kind of a trial or accountability of any kind. As bad as all of that is, America becoming a military dictatorship would be worse, because it would mean there would be no means of redress for anything. As bad a thought is that somehow or other this won't change anything. It's much worse to think of this not changing anything in a totally different country. Trumpland, where one royal family is in charge, and the military responds to them, and the Senate just looks the other way. So I want you to keep in mind that all of this happened in these last 2 weeks. All of this happened against a backdrop of, in America anyway, a pandemic that is still extremely strong and that is spiking in places that had not experienced it before, and against the backdrop of an economic recession that's the worst in 60 years, the worst in the lifetime of most people alive in the country today. So it hasn't really been a fortnight for Last Week in BookTube, at least for me. I've been watching enormous amounts of BookTube and learning a lot, especially about my fellow BookTubers. You know, I mean, we're all in this together. We're all talking about this. We're all watching this on the news. Most of us are locked down. Most of us have been locked down anyway under pandemic-inspired curfews that, in my opinion, have always only been quasi-legal, and that now were met in the last 2 weeks with quasi-paramilitary curfews. It's been a traumatic 2 weeks, and it hasn't felt right to me to pick which haul videos or wrap-up videos or whatever on Just Books. I've watched those videos. I've commented on some of them. I've liked a lot of them, and they've given me a lot of relief from the headlines. But this is the only kind of Last Week in BookTube that I could do today. With any luck, with any kind of hope, maybe the turmoil will have decreased by next week, but not decreased the action, the awareness. I would like to think that this is actually a turning point. That would be fantastic for both of those vectors, systemic racism and the fact that we have armed neo-militaristic goons in our midst, and that when things get rough, they don't care at all whether you live in Scarsdale or South Bronx. They don't care at all. The truncheons come out, the tear gas comes out, the riot helicopters come out. Those two vectors have really combined to sort of erase a fun and friendly Last Week in BookTube. But I'm hoping that by this time next week, those vectors will have died down in their intensity, but there will still be the petitions, there will still be the action, there will still be the heightened awareness. That would be great. What would be great in the small scale to come out of this period would be that the next time a cop on a city street confronts a black man who's not committing any crime, or who's committing, at worst, a minor Class D misdemeanor about which you need a stern conversation and a citation in writing, not death on the street, on camera. My hope is that the outcome of this, at least in the small term, is that the next time a cop wants to overreact like that, it will be met with a different reaction. A very different reaction. That would be great. That is the kind of change that America has needed for a long, long time. Imagine if George Floyd had been pulled over to that police car, handcuffed face down on the street, and when the cop kneeled on his neck, imagine how the situation would have been different if the 4 people who were watching immediately swarmed the cops, just pulling them off. I know you're going to arrest me. I know you might shoot me, but no, this isn't going to happen again. I'm not going to stand here and watch. Imagine what would have happened if that had happened. It would have been a very different moment. I would like to think that the inevitable, a moment like that is inevitable in the future. You can't, as has been told to me in the last 2 weeks, you can't change an entire system overnight. It's a generational thing. I would like to think that the next time an incident like that happens, it goes very differently. It'd be nice if we're talking baby steps, it'd be nice if some of the other police officers stepped in instead of just standing there bored and disinterested watching while their colleague kills someone. That would be a step in the right direction. I'm hoping that we've turned that corner. But anyway, in any case, this is Last Week in BookTube. It couldn't be anything else. I will decide whether or not I want to upload this, but there was nothing else I could talk about. And again, I want to end by urging you to do your research and act with whatever money you can spare, with your signature, with your influence, with your time, whatever it takes. If you act, if we all act, then we can capitalize on this momentum. I would like to think we could capitalize on this momentum and on the fact that it's all young people, that this is young people changing the world in which they live. We can help. So I want to end with that. Do your research. You've seen as many links, as many resource pages as I have. Dig into them, as I have. Dig into them and see what they do, where they go, how effective they are. Decide what you want to do and then do it. So anyway, I'm gonna wrap this up. Sorry for the length. I will wrap this up and I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.